Good morning, everyone. If you can all take your seats, we will proceed. I'm Gabriel Rosenfeld, the president of the Center for Jewish History, and today's symposium was planned over a year ago in a world that, of course, was well aware of the existence of anti-Semitism but had not yet seen the terrible attacks of October 7th. Since that date, needless to say, we've adjusted our symposium's focus in a variety of ways. While scholars in the United States and Europe have spent recent years exploring the worrisome intensification of anti-Semitism on the right wing of the political spectrum, they've become newly aware that anti-Semitic views are also held by segments of the political left. Recent events have further renewed the long-standing debate among scholars about how to understand anti-Semitism, both as a real-world phenomenon and as a scholarly concept. We continue to face such difficult challenges as identifying the line between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, determining the difference between free speech and hate speech, and deciding the proper role that universities should play in navigating these highly charged issues. Underlying all these challenges, it goes without saying, is the tension between analysis and advocacy in the realm of scholarship and education. Today's program is committed to answering these and other questions by employing a historical perspective. And like all the symposia in the Jewish Public History Forum, we believe that bringing world-renowned historians, journalists, and community leaders to CJH and having them discuss topics of Jewish concern with the general audience can foster historical literacy at a time when it's more needed than ever. So, the format of today's symposium is relatively straightforward. As you will see on your programs, we have gathered more than 20 prominent panelists to discuss 5 topics pertaining to contemporary anti-Semitism. Each session will run approximately 1 hour in length, with a final section of 15 minutes roughly devoted to audience Q&A. We'll have 30-minute breaks in between sessions when you can grab refreshments, purchase books at our book fair, and check out Yeshiva University Museum's wonderful new Maimonides exhibit in the Popper Gallery, which is just off the Great Hall. There will also be a special tour led by Yeshiva University Museum's Executive Director Gabe Goldstein at 1 p.m. Also, I should add, during the breaks, you can check out the new exhibit in the Blavatnik Gallery on the Soviet Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. And upstairs in the Rosenberg and Winnick galleries, you can see our new Jewish comic book exhibit and laboratory. And incidentally, both of those exhibits also thematize the topic of anti-Semitism. Before we proceed formally with our first panel, I would like to sincerely thank our sponsors. This symposium is presented in partnership with Indiana University's Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism, otherwise known as ISCA, and has received generous support from the David Berg Foundation, the Achilles and Bodman Foundation, the Combat Anti-Semitism Movement, the American Jewish Committee's Edward M. Chase Educational Fund, Robert S. Rifkind, the Moise Safra Foundation, and the Office of the President of Fairfield University. I should add that we are especially fortunate today to have national, state, and local politicians with us to deliver remarks at the beginning of each of the sessions, either live or via video. I would also like to thank all of you here in the audience and those watching online for contributing to what I hope will be a robust conversation. On a personal note, I would also like to highlight the collaborative origins of today's symposium by noting that I personally would not be here today were it not for the influence of my father, Professor Alvin Rosenfeld, who founded the Indiana University Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism 13 years ago, and also founded the Robert A. and Sandra S. Bourne's Jewish Studies program more than 40 years ago. He is now in his 56th year of teaching. This is when you're supposed to clap, by the way. At Indiana University, and will be moderating the 5th session. So, before we begin panel 1, we have some words of welcome on video from Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, and if we could play the video.
Hi everyone, it's Senator Chuck Schumer, and I want to thank the Center for Jewish History for inviting me to share a few words during your anti-Semitism symposium. I'd also like to thank the panelists and Indiana University's Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism for bringing attention to this issue. My friends, there is no words for the horror that happened in Israel on October 7th. the most Jews killed in a single day since the Holocaust. It brings us all back to much darker days. And as you know, these are frightening times for Jewish Americans. Anti-Semitism is on the rise in America by as much as over 360% following October 7th. And history shows that when anti-Semitism rears its ugly head and it's not dealt with directly, it grows into a deadly force. Elie Wiesel said, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." So every American, every citizen of the world must call out and condemn anti-Semitism whenever and wherever we see it, before it metastasizes into something worse. That's why I went to the Senate floor to deliver a major speech about the rise in anti-Semitism in America. You may have heard about it. It's received wide plaudits throughout the country. I've talked about anti-Semitism on the far right and the far left. I encourage you to listen to it and send it to your friends if you haven't seen it already. And below, you will see a link that will allow you to see or hear the speech. I spoke out because of the highest Jewish elected official in the country and the highest elected official ever in America. I felt an obligation to say aloud what is felt within the hearts of so many Jewish people across the country and around the world. I'm also fighting to increase funding for the nonprofit security grant program, which helps religious institutions like our synagogues, our shuls, and our yeshivas protect themselves from hate crimes, vandalism, and terrorism attacks. We've increased this funding significantly over the years. We started, when I started the program, it had $90 million. It was doubled to $180 million in 2021. And now, in the new supplemental, the security supplemental, we're pushing for $1 billion for this program to make sure families can safely attend synagogues or go to the JCC without fear. So thank you for holding this great symposium, and I look forward to working with you to stamp out anti-Semitism.
So our first session today is what is anti-Semitism? Definitions and debates, which more or less sheds light on the obvious point that if we want to address anti-Semitism, we have to understand what it is to begin with. This, however, is a surprisingly difficult task. Not only have scholars disagreed for years and years about the utility of the term anti-Semitism to describe instances of Jew hatred over the course of many centuries, they continue to debate whether certain words, certain phrases, or ideas, or behaviors, or movements, or individuals are or are not anti-Semitic. So, to give us a sense of the complexities of defining anti-Semitism, we are fortunate to have three prominent experts with us this morning. And before making my formal introductions, obviously I have to announce a couple of changes. Professor Derek Penslar has had to withdraw from our first panel, and when I spoke to him, he requested that I read the following statement. I am mindful of my role as co-chair of the Harvard Task Force on Combating Anti-Semitism, and since at this symposium I would invariably be asked to speak about goings-on at Harvard, and since the task force is only now just being put together and its plan of action is being formed, it would not be appropriate for me to make public comments at this time. So, we don't have Derek with us, unfortunately, today. I'm also saddened to point out that our second panelist, Ken Marcus, had a death in the family on Shabbat and cannot be with us as well. And of course, although we regret both of their absence, we're extremely fortunate to have two outstanding speakers serving in their place. Our first panelist here in the middle is Glenn Diner, who is the Carl and Dorothy Bennett Professor of Judaic Studies and Director of the Bennett Center for Judaic Studies at Fairfield University, and is also a member of the Center for Jewish History's Academic Advisory Council. He is the author or editor of numerous books, including the brand new study, The Light of Learning, Hasidism in Poland on the Eve of the Holocaust, and there will be an event celebrating that book's publication early this spring. Our second panelist, Jeffrey Veidlinger, is the Joseph Brodsky Collegiate Professor of History and Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. He's the author of 4 award-winning books on the history of Jewish life in Russia and Ukraine, including most recently, In the Midst of Civilized Europe, the Pogroms of 1918-1921, and the Onset of the Holocaust. And he, too, has a major role in the Center for Jewish History's Academic Advisory Council. He, in fact, is chair, and he's served with tremendous skill in the last several years in that capacity. Our third panelist is Miriam F. Ellman, who has served as Executive Director of the Academic Engagement Network since 2019. From 2009 to 2022, she was a tenured Associate Professor of Political Science at Syracuse University and is the editor of 7 books, including Overcoming Intractable Conflicts, New Approaches to Constructive Transformations, and Jerusalem, Conflict and Cooperation in a Contested City. So, with all the preliminaries now out of the way, let's get into our focus. We're going to talk for 45 minutes roughly before we turn to Q&A about 3 aspects of anti-Semitism. We're going to talk about it conceptually, we're going to discuss it historically, and we're also going to talk about how it's been used and continues to be used politically in our present-day polarized world. So, Glenn, if we could maybe start with you and ask the question, why is it so hard to define anti-Semitism? And potentially, if you can reflect on the current campus climate, the current political climate, and how that might be impeding this larger analytical goal of trying to figure out what it even is.
Okay, thanks so much, Gav, and thanks to everybody for bearing with us with all these changes. I do feel I should acknowledge the important work of Derek Penzler, both in the study of anti-Semitism and Zionism, and I really feel we should acknowledge also how problematic it is and the chilling effect that occurs when somebody's arguments and words are suddenly used against them and often twisted and used for a certain agenda. I think all of us feel a little bit now worried that our words too are going to be twisted and used, and so really there is a kind of chilling effect that I want to acknowledge. At the same time, I also would like to try to rise above it. Derek's new book, most recent book, is calls Zionism an Emotional State. I think we can say the same about anti-Semitism and attempts to resist anti-Semitism. There's a lot of emotion in all of this. Without being too boring, though, I would like to try to get a little beyond the emotion and the impulse and reasonably discuss the various problematics of anti-Semitism and, yes, anti-Zionism. First, a definition. I really feel that if you're going to sum it up, you have to think about exaggerated fears and outrage over manifestations of Jewish power. And that can be manifestations of Jewish economic power, real or imagined, power over the media, even power over religion, deicide accusations and so on. And this could be affecting and influencing attitudes towards Israel, which is perhaps also, being feared and resented for its manifestations of power. What makes it so difficult to define anti-Semitism, though, is I think what we find is a plausible deniability. You can appear to be fighting for a righteous cause and yet have an anti-Jewish agenda, or at least have the effect be attacks on Jews. For example, if we go back to, say, early modern Poland, the righteous cause that social reformers embraced was protecting peasants against economic exploitation. But they wind up blaming Jews for that economic exploitation and not the nobility, who actually owns the vast majority of the land. One example. Another example would be Marx and other communist thinkers who claim and really probably desire to be protecting the workers, but yet somehow it comes around to blaming and targeting Jews as capitalists. This also happens in the McCarthy era. In this country, McCarthyism, anti-communism, suddenly, Jews are being attacked as communists, and it goes on and on. Now, in the current context, I think there's a plausible deniability in a lot of what we're seeing campus protests and protests on behalf of Palestinians more generally, which is, of course, a righteous cause, Palestinian self-determination, human rights. But we've seen a kind of sadism to the way that this is being expressed, the ripping down of hostage posters and often straying into outright anti-Semitic attacks, that really makes us feel that this is about more than just a righteous, cause for Palestinian self-determination. I really think that Jewish students on campuses are feeling besieged and silenced, and it's a very uncomfortable situation that we have to acknowledge. And it's very easy, if you're feeling anti-Jewish animus to begin with, to latch onto this cause, and suddenly it becomes more against Jews than it is in favor of Palestinians. I also want to say, though, that this can cut both ways, because there's also a kind of plausible deniability in attempts to resist anti-Semitism. We've seen in the case of Harvard how a righteous cause, which is combating anti-Semitism, can also be exploited for political purposes to fight against, diversity, equity, inclusion, and wokeism, and so on and so forth. So this can really also apply in the reverse.
Thank you, Glenn. Jeff, as a historian as well who's dealt with anti-Semitism in multiple historical contexts, you obviously have had a working definition in your own mind, but today, as Glenn was saying, it's tougher than ever. How do you approach this question of defining anti-Semitism in this overheated climate?
Thanks. So first, before I answer that question, I too want to thank Gav for inviting me to participate on this panel, which he invited me to do about an hour ago, based on that. So I've, in that hour, thought up the answers to these questions. I also wanted to thank, by the way, Alvin Rosenfeld for offering me my first job in 1999, which was at Indiana University, where I had the honor of replacing another great scholar who had just left Indiana University for University of Toronto, and that was Derek Penslar. And since then, I too have admired Derek Penslar's scholarship and was really looking forward, actually, to coming here and hearing what he had to say about anti-Semitism instead of you hearing what I have to say. But in addition to Derek's scholarship, I also want to say something. The very first time I became involved in leadership within the field of Jewish studies writ large was on the board of the Association for Jewish Studies, which is the largest Jewish studies organization in the United States. And I was just invited on the board as a fairly junior faculty member. And the very first board meeting I was at, there was a protester. And I can't remember what the protester was protesting, but he was a member of the Association for Jewish Studies who was demanding to be heard for whatever they were advocating in the room. And everybody was trying to get this person out and calling security. And I remember Derek coming in and speaking with the protester and handling it so deftly and firmly, and having the protester leave and take up the issue elsewhere. So I just wanted to acknowledge also his temperament, which I think makes him very well suited for the role that he is fulfilling. Anyway, in answer to the question about anti-Semitism and how to define it, well, I don't know. But I'll talk a little bit about the ways in which it has been defined over time. And I think one way of thinking about anti-Semitism, and from here I draw from the way a lot of us have been talking about racism in the United States, which is that it's systemic and embedded. That notion of systemic anti-Semitism, I think, is very useful to understand how anti-Semitism originated. And that is that it is built in to the fabric of Western European civilization, because Christianity emerged in response to Judaism and against Judaism. And early Christian writings were formulated by people who regarded themselves as Jews often, but against Judaism. And over time and over the medieval and early modern period, the idea of Jews as the other in Europe became so ingrained within the European mindset. Jews were the people who were alleged to have crucified Jesus. Jews were the people who refused to see the truth of Christianity. Jews were always presented as the other. When people went to church, when Christians went to church, they saw depictions on the wall of Jews crucifying Jesus. And And even though that doesn't mean that all European Christians were anti-Semitic by any means or anything like that, it means that this notion was deeply embedded within European thought and within the European tradition. We have to understand that to understand how deeply ingrained anti-Semitism is. So this is an early stage of anti-Semitism, the systemic anti-Semitism. I think with the Enlightenment and in the modern era, a new element of anti-Semitism comes into being, and that's conspiratorial anti-Semitism. And that's the notion that Jews are behind everything going on, that anything you're suspicious of, Jews are behind it. And this also has a trope that dates back to early Christianity, to the myth that Jews crucified Jesus, right? The Roman Empire crucified Jesus. The Roman Empire was the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. And yet, there was a notion that the people who were actually pulling the strings behind the Roman Empire were the Jews or the Pharisees. And that trope continues, so that anything we disagree with, we can say the Jews are behind it, and people understand that and accept that. So, for the period that I study, which is the pogroms of the early 20th century, every political position could discredit their enemies by saying the Jews are behind it. So if you're a Bolshevik and you want to discredit capitalism, you say, oh, well, capitalism, it's just a toy of the Jews. The Jews are just using the capitalist system to exploit you. And because of this systemic anti-Semitism, because of the way that it's so deeply ingrained within people's mind, they say, now it makes sense. And similarly, the capitalists or the old elites can discredit the Bolsheviks and discredit socialism or discredit any ideology they want by saying the Jews are actually behind it. They're the ones who are secretly pulling the strings. And then people say, oh, now I get it, so now I'll vote against the Bolsheviks or vote against the socialists. So any political position can be discredited by claiming that it's just a ploy that the Jews are using to exploit. And then the third component of anti-Semitism that I want to talk about briefly is this notion of Jews and power that comes out of the idea of Jews and conspiracy. And that is that Jews are secretly the ones in power, that they're the ones who are pulling the strings. Now, what's interesting about that is, historically, Jews have been discriminated against precisely on the allegation that they have too much power. And I think in today's world, where we talk about privilege so much and talk about checking one's privilege, this notion of privilege can come into play with anti-Semitism. And Jews often do hold privileged positions within America today for a variety of historical reasons. Jews tend to be a fairly affluent class. Jews have done very well in America for a variety of historical reasons. And so people often claim that they are privileged and therefore oppress them on the grounds that they are privileged. But we know that Jewish privilege can be taken away very quickly because Jews, again, have historically been persecuted precisely on those grounds that they're privileged. So it's a precarious privilege that is very dangerous. And I think this is, comes from is a lot of the roots of what we are seeing today is the precarity of the privileged position that Jews play in the United States and around the world. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Jeff. If we move from the sort of historical perspective to the present-day campus perspective, Miriam, you bring a perspective that is both academic and activist in the sense of directing a nonprofit organization, the Academic Engagement Network, that focuses on campus issues. How has that work, which you've been doing for years, shaped your understanding of what anti-Semitism is?
Thank you so much, and let me also first thank Gav and thank Alvin and the Center and ISCA for inviting me to this important symposium today, one day after International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Truly important conversations that we're having today. And also let me start by saying I too regret that Derek Pensler could not be on our panel today. As I mentioned last week in an interview for Jewish Insider, there's a lot of healing that has to happen at Harvard. There's a lot of outrage, there's a lot of hurt, and I do hope that the new task force can bring people together and meet people where they are, and I do wish it much success. It's a lot of work that has to happen on that campus and others. So let me start by saying that it's evident that on many campuses, anti-Semitism often masquerades as anti-Zionism. And since we're here in New York City, I thought I might mention a few examples from campuses right here. When student groups at NYU claim that, quote, the Zionist grip on the media is omnipresent, we have a case in point. As my colleagues mentioned, it echoes the language of conspiracy, of dark webs, of nefarious networks. And because I follow the goings-on at my alma mater, I happened across an incident at Columbia late October. The leader of an LGBTQ student club decided to exclude most of her Jewish peers from a film event. It's free Palestine over here, she wrote publicly. We are within our rights to disinvite Zionists, who are a genocidal group of people. Now, there's nothing new about Zionism being demonized as a racist ideology akin to white supremacy. That kind of rhetoric is a dime a dozen on campuses. And to just pick up on the remarks of my colleagues, Jewish students long before October 7th have been ostracized, excluded, made to feel unwelcome on campuses, even from spaces that have absolutely nothing to do with Israel or the Middle East, like sexual assault survivor groups, Black Lives Matter, fossil fuel divestment campaigns. So here we have Jewish young people who really want to engage in these causes that they care a lot about, and they're being told they can't. One thing I would add is that it's not always important or necessary to assign anti-Semitic intent. Who knows what's in someone's heart? What matters is the impact, the exclusion, the ostracism, the vulnerability, the sense of isolation, the inability to bring your full self onto campus. A few years ago, American political theorist Michael Walzer pointed out that in the most toxic forms of anti-Zionism, Israel is cast as a Nazi state, a uniquely evil state, a child killer state, and all that reinvents or simply updates the tropes and canards of classical anti-Semitism. Robert Wistrich, 20 years ago, also reminded us that anti-Zionism not only negates the legitimate Jewish nationalism, it's also a type of anti-Semitic discourse replete with stereotypes. I want to just end with something that not all of you may know, but for the last 7 years, there's been a national campaign in the American Academy that has worked to cast mainstay Jewish organizations such as the AJC and the ADL as co-conspirators with Israel in some nefarious plot to harm innocent Americans, immigrants, Black and brown people, and minority communities. It's called Deadly Exchange, and this conspiracy theory has become so pervasive and ingrained on campuses today that several years ago, a student at UC Berkeley could casually declare in public at a student government meeting that, quote, the IDF trains the police departments in America to kill Black people. Jewish students who complained were told to, quote, dry your white tears. On campuses across our country, bandied about are ancient tropes that cloak themselves in modern attire. They need to be recognized, and they need to be condemned for what they are.
Thank you, Miriam. As we shift to our second section and move away from discussing anti-Semitism conceptually to addressing it historically, one of the through lines of today's symposium is going to be, of course, the change marked by October 7th. And if I could turn to our panelists and ask them to reflect a little bit about how those events, the events of October 7th, and of course the reactions since then with the Israel-Hamas war, how, if at all, those events have changed, how they think about anti-Semitism. Perhaps, Glenn, if I could start with you and address the question of continuities and breaks with regard to this date from several months ago.
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of the most shocking and disturbing aspects of protests in the aftermath of October 7th is that the violence seemed to be being justified as a kind of liberation, you know, and as a just resistance. It's not the first time this has happened. You know, I happen to have just finished a book, as you heard. One of the chapters is on pogroms in interwar Poland, and interestingly enough there, a lot of the rhetoric among right-wing nationalists in Poland was that Jews were dominating, they didn't use occupying, that's an updated term, but dominating Poland and the Polish economy. There was a fourth partition of Poland, it was the Jewish partition, And when pogroms would happen, and other forms of anti-Jewish violence, involving sexual violence, murder, and extensive injury and destruction of property, it was being justified as a kind of self-defense and a kind of liberation. So for me, it just kind of reawoke that idea that Jews are being held accountable for their own victimization under the guise of some sort of self-defense or liberation. So that's one historical connection that I drew. I'd also like to talk about something that really hasn't been discussed much in historical anti-Semitism, and that's the religious component. It is possible that supersessionism, the idea that Christianity and Islam have superseded Judaism and have certain privileged position above, sort of in the hierarchy above Judaism, is playing into a lot of this. There does seem to be a kind of undercurrent of resentment that Jews are even, inhabiting this Holy Land when Judaism was supposed to have already been superseded. It's almost as if, Jews inadvertently won the Crusades. That's the way you get this feeling. They violated some sort of a hierarchy, and that becomes, I think, also dangerous and very unseen. It's very coded. But that's another kind of connection that I've seen. Now, if we're going to relate it to post-October 7th, the most amazing thing possibly, well, there are many amazing things, but one of the most amazing things is to see the secular left kind of accepting this Hamas version of Muslim supersessionism, so that it's seemingly acceptable. If you read the Hamas charter, it's acceptable to say that all of this land actually should be Islamicized, and should be an exclusive, hegemonic Muslim entity, which gives, of course, no room for Jewish self-determination. And so I think that's another kind of historical resonance there that maybe needs to be discussed and worked through a lot more. I'm a little optimistic. I think that once we do talk about these things, a sense of fairness could prevail, in which, if we're talking about Palestinian self-determination, well, it's only fair to also be talking about Jewish self-determination and looking at Jewish, roots in this region and so on. But I don't think we're there yet.
Thank you. Jeff, what do you think about the continuities and breaks represented by October 7th?
Yeah, so like Glenn, I was struck by the demonstrations that took place on my campus in the aftermath of October 7th. I mean, I'm used to demonstrations on my campus of all types. But the ways in which the demonstrators, even in the days after October 7th, before the Israeli ground invasion of Gaza began, but the ways in which the demonstrators portrayed Israel as the aggressor, and portrayed October 7th as a liberation movement. Outside my office, there was a large demonstration just on the quad, or the diag as we call it at University of Michigan. There was a large demonstration of people chanting that the oppressors of the Palestinians are the oppressors of all of us. And that reminded me of this conspiracy idea that I was talking about Jews, the same way that Jews were blamed as being the basis of capitalism, the basis of communism. Now the state of Israel is being portrayed as the embodiment of every evil in the world. And we hear that the state of Israel is the embodiment. It's a racist, apartheid, aggressive, genocidal, imperialist, colonial entity. Every evil that people can imagine in the world is now placed on the state of Israel as the embodiment of it. And I think that stems from this same type of conspiratorial idea of anti-Semitism. It's a simplistic way of understanding the world. The same way that we can understand the evils of any other system by claiming that it's the Jews who are behind it, we can now understand the evil of colonialism or the evil of racism or genocide or apartheid by claiming that Israel is the embodiment of it. It's obviously a false claim, but it's a very easy way of understanding. So, these protesters outside my office that were saying, the oppressors of Israel, so the oppressors of the Palestinians are the oppressors of all of us. And they can say, the reason that you're paying high tuition is because your tax dollars are being used to fund the state of Israel. The reason there is police violence in America is because the IDF is training police in order to commit acts of violence. It's a conspiratorial, simplistic way of thinking, of imagining that we can explain every evil in the world and every evil in America simply by looking at the state of Israel. Obviously a false image and a very disturbing one that we need to figure out how to counter and how to combat.
Thank you, Jeff. Before I turn to Miriam for the third question in the second section, if I could ask those of you who are writing up questions on note cards to start wrapping up your comments, and we'll be collecting them before the third round of questions, then we'll be able to turn to those efficiently. Miriam, when you think about your relationships with college faculty, students, administrators, and so forth, what we might call the stakeholders on college campuses, where do you see how anti-Semitism and its history is misconstrued or misunderstood?
Thank you. And let me just say that we saw this on so many campuses, both, what you've been describing, and it's not only from students. Those anti-Semitic tropes and canards and the trafficking of those anti-Semitic positions are also coming from the faculty. So strong voices back, and your strong voices matter a great deal. I would say that, when Zionism is denigrated, campus officials often tend to view it as a political debate. They don't really see it the way many Jews on campus see it, as a hurtful attack, as a personal affront on identity. It's being unfamiliar with that, right? Being unfamiliar with the Jewish experience, with the history of anti-Semitism, which is really one of the main reasons that campus leaders have so much trouble recognizing it. They tend to view Jewish faith as a set of religious practices. They don't get the concept of Jewish peoplehood, and they really need to appreciate that throughout history, it's the anti-Semites who have minimized Judaism's national and ethnic elements, and this is really a century-old staple of anti-Semitic discourse to divide Jews between the good Jews and the bad Jews, right? So the good cosmopolitan Jew, the assimilated and emancipated citizen who renunciates Jewish national identity, the one who sheds the sense of Jewish peoplehood, and the bad Jew, by contrast, which views themselves as deeply connected to the land of Israel, to the people, to the nation of Israel, to a collective belonging, Am Yisrael, the Jew who embraces the particularity of Judaism. And it's really from here that the dual loyalty canard emerges. So university stakeholders, faculty, as well as administrators really need to understand the historical pressures on Jews to shed their love of Zion, Chibat Zion, an integral component of Jewish identity for most Jews on campus. Scholar Judea Pearl and father of slain journalist Daniel Pearl, a longtime and active member in my organization, appropriately calls all this Zionophobia, an irrational fear and hatred of the Jewish homeland. And since October 7th, we've seen that Zionophobia on campuses across the country. It's not a break with historical trends, but a continuation of them. And let me just close on this question with one point that I think Ken Marcus would have made, and I regret too that my good colleague and friend Ken couldn't be here today, and I'm sorry for his loss and the loss of his family. But I think what Ken might have said is that there's no hate speech exception to the First Amendment, but university leaders also have the right to speak, and they should be condemning anti-Semitism with the same vigor that they do the suffering and pain of other victimized groups. That goes for hateful speech from students. It also goes from hateful speech from their faculty. Diversity of opinion is important. Academic freedom is a core bedrock principle of the academy, but university leaders can also step up and stand up and say, this goes against our values. This speech is morally repugnant, and they can bring better speech to bad speech.
Thank you, Miriam. For our final short section, before we turn to audience Q&A, we're going to turn to the question of politics, which, for better or worse, is inescapable these days. So, Jeff, if I could begin with you. It's well known by everyone up here on the stage and in the audience that anti-Semitism exists on all wings of the political spectrum, and it comes in many different forms. How, as Jews and non-Jews, can we be deft enough to combat anti-Semitism simultaneously on multiple fronts, where we seem to see things threatening us from one perspective one day and somewhere else the other day?
Yeah, so, as I mentioned, I think anti-Semitism is a way of thinking that cuts across political boundaries, but is, this conspiratorial mode of thinking. But I want to comment particularly on the ways that I think we can deal with anti-Semitism in our communities, and really the ways that I have dealt with anti-Semitism in my communities. And that's, I think we need to make a distinction between what I view as three different types of anti-Semitism, or three ways in which it's manifested. And each requires a different response. The first one is what I like to call a naive offense. And a naive offense is often the demonstrators, the student demonstrators on campus, who really don't know any better. And my thoughts to them is I would love to have them in my classroom to teach them about the history of anti-Semitism, the Jewish history, the history of the world, to teach them some context, to help them understand what it means when they're chanting, from the river to the sea, or whatever they may be chanting. Because they don't understand it. They're just latching on to this as a popular movement. And they can be taught, and I've seen it. I have had students come into my class with one set of opinions and leave with another set of opinions because they learned that it's a lot more complex than they previously thought. And that's naive offenses. And that's actually the majority of what we can call campus anti-Semitism, or what people call campus anti-Semitism. They can be educated. They're just naive and ignorant. So that's one type, and that requires education as a response. The second type is provocation. And to give an example of provocation, outside of the synagogue that I attend, every Saturday for the last, I think, about 20 years, there have been a group of protesters that stand with signs saying, "Stop Jewish control over Congress," or gas chambers, ? Really? And these are just anti-Semitic protesters. They can't be educated. They know what they're doing. There's no point in trying to talk to them. Really what we need to do for them is deprive them of oxygen. Just not give them attention, ignore them. They're not going away. They're on public ground. We can't, use the legal system to get rid of them. But that's a provocation. They're not educatable. They're just trying to provoke. They're also not a threat. They've been there for 20 years. They're not going to suddenly pose a physical threat to the synagogue. The third type is threats. And we need to distinguish, is something a threat? And if it's a threat, it requires a completely different type of response, which is calling law enforcement and taking action. And whether it's coming from the political left or coming from the political right, I think in every what people sometimes call incidents of anti-Semitism, we need to identify, is this incident a naive or an ignorant offense? Is it a provocation, or is it a threat? And we need to respond differently to each of those.
Miriam, to address a different aspect of politics, one of the things we're well aware of is that in recent months, Jews are trying to determine who their real friends are, their real allies might be in the fight against anti-Semitism. And liberal Jews in particular have been disappointed that left-of-center allies have been silent on the topic, at least from most metrics. But they realize, many Jews do, that right-wing or right-of-center supporters who now claim to be our allies may be taking that stance for purely instrumental and maybe insincere reasons. So how can Jews pick their allies in the fight against anti-Semitism if their political priorities may not always be aligned with those who are potentially fighting with them?
Thank you. It's a great question. It's a lot easier if you self-identify on the left to condemn right-wing anti-Semitism, right, and to minimize it on the left or pretend that it doesn't exist, but it does exist there. And so the first step really is to recognize that it does exist, and to root it out, and to not tolerate it, and to be sharply critical of those in your own political camp and circles who traffic in it. We should stop with the oppression Olympics. Right-wing anti-Semitism and left-wing anti-Semitism are both dangerous for American Jewry. They both need to be confronted, and we need to worry about both of them. There's a reluctance to call out anti-Semitism that originates from minority communities, when anti-Jewish hate is coming from the very same people who are deeply committed to the fight against injustice. It causes a great deal of cognitive dissonance, and I see that all the time on campus. For a lot of people, it just doesn't compute. Now, if it wasn't evident before, what's become so crystal clear since October 7th is that partners on the left have turned out to be not such committed allies when it comes to combating anti-Semitism, and there's a real sense of feeling abandoned, which is something we're hearing a lot of from academics across the country in my organization. And we should be making it clear, allies are those who stand up for Jewish victims in the same way that they would for other victimized communities. We shouldn't tolerate any exceptions, any double standards, any hypocrisy. I want to raise, in the last couple minutes on this question, the shameful, deafening silence from the feminist community about the atrocities and horrific sexual violence by Hamas against Israeli women and girls. That there were faculty among the rape deniers was horrible, yet there they were, a professor at the University of Minnesota, another at the University of California, who publicly stated that the massacre of Jews was fabricated and that women were lying. One even compared the Israeli survivor testimony to white women who got black men lynched after falsely accusing them of rape. That was a public comment. And consider, too, the National Women's Studies Association, the leading academic organization for faculty in the field of gender studies. It held its annual conference at the end of October with many panels on the Israel-Hamas war. Not a single talk devoted to the Hamas premeditated use of rape as a weapon of war. They released 2 statements as well, and they, talked about the oppression of the Palestinians, and they talked about the oppression of Palestinian women, and they stood in solidarity, and that's fine. But they had no word to say about the sexual violence perpetrated by Hamas terrorists or the plight of the female hostages abducted to Gaza. Not even after the forensic evidence speaks for the young women who were brutalized and murdered. Still, 3 months later, not one word. That kind of selective empathy is unconscionable. And women faculty in my organization denounced it as a seismic moral failure. The organization's professional standing has been truly diminished by this anti-Semitism, and here in this forum, I'm calling for the National Women's Studies Association to do better and to address anti-Semitism in the field of gender and women's studies and in its association. The appalling crimes perpetrated against Israeli women and girls isn't just unjust, it's a sign of deeper anti-Semitic biases that must be addressed. The reluctance to believe in the accounts of Jewish women is such a stark deviation from the Me Too movement of believing survivors of gender-based violence. It mimics the patterns of Holocaust denial and furthers the stereotypes of Jews as liars and as untrustworthy. My recommendation, Gav, would be, let's pick allies who have a moral compass. Let's not choose allies who claim to love us, but then hate on others. Let's not do that either. Let's pick the ones who are resolute in standing up against all hate, including Jewish hate. And then let's use our own resources to in turn fight for others in America who are still vulnerable, who are still in need of protection, because this is a shared struggle and allyship needs to work in both ways.
Thank you for applauding our panelists. Truly, this has been a very, very insightful set of comments that only allow us to move forward into an even more enlightening set of questions. I think I have at least 40 questions up here, and it's been a stressful morning for all kinds of reasons. This is only adding to the mix. So, oh, of course, I forgot to. Never mind. Sorry, I forgot to ask. I forgot to see. This is the chaos. Glenn. To wrap up our session, Is there any hope that rigorous definitions of anti-Semitism can be of use in a climate of political polarization?
Okay, it's very difficult to follow this passion and conviction, but I do want to address one thing, which is why I had the chutzpah to intervene just now, and that is there is a divide in this whole definitional problem, I think, between academia and the rest of the world. And I think a lot of it comes down to what academics do or feel they're supposed to be doing. That is, we're not supposed to be advocates, activists, we're really supposed to be critics. So when we come up with a definition of anti-Semitism and we treat anti-Zionism and that kind of thing, I guess it's easy to be seen as a traitor because we're trying really hard to preserve the discourse. It should be possible to criticize the state of Israel, Israeli policy, forms of Zionism, especially if you've somehow been the victim of one system or another. You should be able to criticize these things without being called anti-Semitic. And that's where the disconnect, I think, is. So when we rush to the defense of our colleague Derek Penslar, this is a little bit of what's going on. We want to try to preserve the discourse. If I could be a little helpful here, I want to invoke another colleague, Ethan Katz, who has been speaking out about different, I guess, distinctions between forms of anti-Zionism. He calls one critical anti-Zionism, which he accepts, and that is what I referred to earlier. Figures like Edward Said have criticized aspects of Zionism without denying that there's any kind of Jewish connection, to the land of Israel that's historical, that's just and understandable. Sometimes it's done grudgingly, as it was done by Khalidi at the end of his book, 100 Years' War on Palestine. There's still a concession there that Jews have this connection and have a certain right to self-determination. But Katz also brings up another form of anti-Zionism, which is he calls negationist, and that is Jews just have no claim at all to self-determination. So everybody gets a state except you, kind of a claim. And that, of course, is problematic. I think we can more comfortably classify it as anti-Semitism. Now, what is the problem on faculties today? How can it be that we're feeling so betrayed? I think that many faculty have lost their way in the sense they've felt the need to become advocates rather than critics. And they've fallen too easily into certain what have become academic orthodoxies. This idea of settler colonialism, that and very racialized settler colonialism, that the state of Israel is somehow a white colonialist project that has dispossessed people of color who are indigenous to that land. Many have just uncritically accepted that model, and I think it's a little bit our fault for not contesting it more. I mean, maybe there's a fear of being called racist or privileged or whatever, but it should be pretty easy to point out that many Jews, in the land of Israel, in Palestine, were arguably indigenous, had lived there for centuries. Many more, of course, came as refugees after the Holocaust, and the majority really refugees from Middle Eastern countries. That doesn't sound like colonialism to me. And at least it needs to be much more complicated. And the idea that, Jews in Israel are white, well, actually, since really a majority came from Middle Eastern countries, these are Jews of color, and that needs to be acknowledged. So I think that there's hope if we can actually have these kinds of conversations without the censorship that goes along with certain, accusations and buzzwords. At the end of the day, I think many people really are fair-minded and do believe that if you're going to fight for Palestinian self-determination, it's only fair to also consider Jewish claims and Jewish rights to self-determination, and that can move us forward. But right now, I think we're in a moment where everything's been so racialized and so polarized that it's just difficult to get out of. But hopefully, fora like this will allow us to move beyond and really, and really begin returning to that kind of critical discourse that we're all trying to preserve here.
Thank you, Glenn. So Glenn, that proved to be a fortuitous gaffe on my part because you already just answered two of the questions that I was gonna begin with in terms of the tension among between advocacy and analysis among scholars, faculty on college campuses. So let's try and do our best to get through only a fraction, regrettably, of these really fantastic questions. The first is very simple, and I'd like to just pose it to all three of you. I'm going to synthesize two different note cards here. What does anti-Zionism look like that is not anti-Semitic? Maybe if we just go down the line. Jeff, do you want to start us off? Is there a kind of anti-Zionism that can be expressed that is not anti-Semitic? And the corollary is, how can proud Jews and allies of Jews express valid critiques of Israel without being accused of being anti-Semitic? Same question, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are many ways of expressing anti-Zionism without being anti-Semitic. Zionism is a modern movement within Judaism. Emerges as a political movement in the late 19th century. And there are people who seek a return to Judaism before Zionism. That's not an anti-Semitic reaction. I mean, there's a legitimate critique, I think, within the Jewish community over the ways in which many young people today in America understand their Jewish identity solely through Zionism and Holocaust awareness, and don't actually know much about the religious traditions or the other traditions within Judaism that have sustained the Jewish people for 2,000 years. And so there are some advocates who are saying that we need to return to the religious roots of Judaism, to religious identity as Jews, and do away, or at least bring down, de-escalate maybe, Zionism and Holocaust awareness as the key components of Jewish identity. And many surveys have shown this, that Jews in America today, particularly young Jews, identify their Jewishness with those two components primarily. And there's a legitimate critique of saying that this is a problem with sustaining Jewish tradition and Jewish identity in the long term.
Miriam, what do you think about the question?
So I want to go back to the academy and the classroom. I think there definitely is room, and in fact, I taught for 25 years on Israel-Palestine, religion and politics in the Middle East. And please don't call me an anti-Semite, because I did talk about pre-1948 anti-Zionism. And there were many ways in which Jews in Europe and the US talked about how to solve the Jewish question pre-Israel. Right? But the problem now is that it's not a discussion of scholarship. It's a rallying cry, and much of the anti-Zionism that we see today is so infused with the anti-Semitic tropes, canards, and conspiracies that we've been talking about that it really does have to be confronted. And let's face it, half of world Jewry lives in Israel, and world Jewry will not survive without a strong and secure Israel. And so, the fact that on campuses, Jewish kids, young people are being told, you can't belong in these clubs for sexual assault survivor, or Black Lives Matter, or climate change, until you disavow the Zionism. And it is a key part for them, right? I mean, it's what poll data shows. It is a central part to the way many Jews here in America define their Jewishness. That becomes, discrimination. That becomes a bigotry. There's absolutely no problem to have a discussion of, or activism on pro-Palestinian nationalism, Palestinian rights and justice. We need to create on campuses and off campuses a healthy space for that, which is not infused with anti-Zionism. And that's absolutely possible, and it's absolutely possible to model that.
And Glenn, if I can turn to you to address this question, let me also just throw in one of the sub-questions. Is it possible to call for a ceasefire in the current war without being accused of being anti-Semitic? Not to put you on the spot.
I think it's very easy to impugn someone's motives, but we have to imagine the possibility that we're talking about Jews in this case. There are Jews who feel a real discomfort that Jewish sovereignty or self-determination should come at somebody else's expense. I think it's a reasonable thing to be sensitive to and upset about. So if somebody decides, you know what, I'm not going to support this thing because it's coming at someone else's expense, it's curtailing someone else's sovereignty, I can't call somebody like that self-hating or anti-Semitic. It seems like a reasonable concern. Now, my own feeling, I happen to believe as a historian that it's much more likely that another Holocaust would happen if you don't have a strong state of Israel. I agree with these sentiments, but I'm not going to say that it's wrong to have your moral qualms, and there's got to be a way of expressing those moral qualms and being allowed to say it within a Jewish context, in a Jewish communal context, without being called a traitor. This is not a simple issue. What do we do with non-Jews living in the state of Israel? Should they be full and equal citizens? And what happens if demographically that starts to threaten, the idea of a Jewish state? These are all real issues that need to be worked through and discussed. And I just want to point out, in case no one's convinced by what I just said, just remember, there are a lot of Haredim, a lot of ultra-Orthodox Jews who are very opposed to Zionism, maybe for different reasons than what I just said, but there's a sense that this is somehow a violation of authentic Judaism as they conceive it. I don't think they're anti-Semitic.
Thank you. A second round of questions that I'm, again, synthesizing several note cards into. One asks about the competing legal definitions of what qualifies as anti-Semitism. Without getting too into the weeds and discussing the differences between the IRA definition and the Nexus definition, the Jerusalem Declaration, and so forth, to what degree is this whole conversation about creating legally binding definitions of anti-Semitism workable in this current climate? Miriam, maybe you want to take a stab at that?
I actually just want to mention on the ceasefire, too, that question. I'm wearing this, bring them home now. There's a lot of, as you know, if you follow Israeli media, as I do daily, there's a lot of controversy in society, in the government as well, and not everybody has the same viewpoint on how this ends and how this ends. And so critiquing policy is not anti-Semitic. Critiquing politicians is not anti-Semitic, but you do need to have a sense of what are those historical tropes and canards that can get you, that begin to move you into those waters that make fellow Jews feel very uncomfortable, right? And so there is a kind of a checklist you can use, right? Like, is your argument something in which you can actually have reform in Israel at the societal level, at the state level? That is fair game. It's fair game for our country or any country, right? But it's, in a sense, the singling out of Israel for opprobrium when no other country faces the same kind of condemnation. Those kinds of double standards, what Sharansky calls the 3 Ds, demonization, delegitimization, and double standards. I think that's the kind of discourse we need to focus on, not the criticism of policy and practice. I mean, Israelis criticize that all the time, right? So we can as well.
So maybe to rephrase the question, why are we not talking about these competing definitions of anti-Semitism in the legal sphere? That's how the original question was actually formulated. Yeah, take a stab, anybody. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I'll say, I'm not sure how helpful they are in actually helping us identify what anti-Semitism is. There are several definitions. The most prominent one is the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism, in which most of the examples it gives of anti-Semitism come from relations with Israel and come from aspects of Israel. And there's arguments that it can limit freedom of speech, or it can limit the ability to criticize Israel. The problem with these definitions is, as they say, it depends on the context. They don't really help solve the problem. We don't have approved definitions of other types of racism on campus that we use. It's really a matter of trying to foster climates in which people feel comfortable in whatever organization they're in. So, there's a lot of pressure for universities to adopt one of these definitions of anti-Semitism. I think we would still be arguing about whether it meets that definition or not. I just don't think it's a matter of naming the term. I think what we need to do is to foster a climate on our campuses and in our communities in which all people feel comfortable to express themselves and to express their own identities in whatever way they want to, as long as it doesn't impinge on the expression of other people's identities. I just don't think the definitions really help us get there.
Glenn, do you want to add anything to that?
Look, I think the definitions are long. They have lots of bullet points. They're very complicated. I studied them last night and was a little exasperated as a result. So I think that alone, you've got academics overcomplicating things, which isn't the first time that's ever happened. I did want to address the ceasefire sub-question too, and I felt like the rhetoric was very one-sided. It's that Israel should have a ceasefire. There was no call for Hamas to have a ceasefire to return hostage, which really is a war crime.
Again, because we only had a fraction of time to deal with wonderful questions, I would invite everyone to, as we now move to our break, between the first and second sessions, to feel free to ask any of our panelists the questions as follow-ups. There's coffee, there's pastries, there's books to be signed, there's exhibits to be visited. So thank you for your kind attention for panel number 1. We will have a half an hour break now before panel 2.